the transformation of the economic model towards a circular and sustainable economic model, including European trade, which is fully aligned with our climate targets. And fourth, the reduction of pollution, and the minister emphasized chemical pollution. We've also heard from Maria Nera from the World Health Organization. She stressed the need to really ratchet up ambition for the reduction of air pollution, and she made a very clear case that decarbonization has a double benefit for the climate and for health. Now, we would like to hear from a diverse group of stakeholders what their perspectives, their visions, their recommendations are, what needs to be done to chart the path to a healthy planet. We invite all the stakeholders to share with us what they expect and what is it that they want to achieve, what are the meaningful steps that they want to achieve in the coming 3 years to make sure that the European Green Deal delivers on its promises: carbon neutrality, zero pollution, thriving biodiversity, and of course well-being for all. More specifically, what is it that the European governments can do, those governments who will be in the driving seat behind the EU's environmental agenda with the upcoming presidencies, the next trios with France, the Czech Republic and Sweden, and then Spain, Belgium and Hungary. We will also address the EU's global responsibilities and the need for European leadership in finding solutions that work for all. Now let's first have a look at the results of the question that we put to you, to the audience. How do you feel about the European Green Deal 2 years in? When I last looked at the results, I saw that there was a slight majority of people who felt that, well, the European Green Deal hasn't done enough, but it's fixable. It's 59% of you said that. Nearly as many, 52%, said that the European Green Deal has done far too little, but it's fixable. It's just fixable. Basically, nobody thinks that it's too much. Also, very few people think that the European Green Deal as it stands now is just right. And a smaller minority, but still to be considered, think that the European Green Deal is not fixable. So I guess the overall outcome is that most of you have hope, have high expectations, but we need to raise ambition, and we need to make sure that we fill the objectives on paper with real proposals that deliver rapidly. So let me go to our first panelist. Tetiana Stadnyk joined Youth and Environment Europe in 2019. She's now the Secretary General of YEE, the largest independent network of youth-led environmental organizations in Europe. Tetiana is originally from Ukraine, where she started her work with young people and therefore also brings in a European perspective beyond the borders of the EU. So Tetiana, what kind of world is it that you would like to inherit? How do European environmental and climate policies, but also policies at member state level, at local government level, have to change to ensure a healthy planet for everyone and everywhere, especially for future generations?
Thank you so much, Patrizia, and thank you so much for having me at this panel. When I started my journey in the environmental youth movement, I was 16, and that was almost 10 years ago. And back then, I imagined that by now, Europe would have already acted on what civil society and activists have been asking for decades. I thought that by 2021, Europe would have already drastically cut its emissions, phased out most of the fossil fuels, and was already in full swing implementing the principles of circular economy. That would be called global leadership in the face of the climate crisis. Instead, the EU is currently acting as a sort of a student trying to write their thesis, savoring a sense of accomplishment for setting up a file, which one day is supposed to be the thesis, enjoying life with no sense of urgency, delaying the actual work up until the moment when one can no longer do anything else. They have to sacrifice sleep, social life, survive on fast food, if any food at all, and a harsh dose of adrenaline that keeps them going. One might think that you grow out of this planning fallacy the moment you finish school, but when it comes to the climate crisis, unfortunately, we see politicians not only procrastinating, but also waiting to relay the work onto the younger generation the night before the deadline. The 55% emission reduction target by 2030 is not enough. Every amount of greenhouse gas that is allowed today narrows the remaining options for reducing emissions after 2030. Depleting much of the greenhouse gas emissions budget already by 2030 means that my generation will have to face drastic restrictions after 2030 in order to reach the target of the Paris Agreement. That would impact practically every type of activity because almost all aspects of human life still involves the emissions of greenhouse gases. That would drastically limit human freedoms. And it's not only about my generation, it is about future generation, but also about your generation too. 55% by 2030 reduction target is not enough. We have to act with greater speed and urgency. The fact that the agreement on the 55% reduction target was reached is already a political achievement, but the climate target is still well below the 65% required by the science. As a rich economy, as well as a major historic emitter, the EU should strive for emission reductions of at least 65% by 2030. For that to be achieved, we need all pieces of revised legislation in the Fit for 55 package to go for their maximum of emission. The member states and the European Parliament have to ensure that the Fit for 55 package becomes fit for 1.5 degrees Celsius to increase our chances to keep the global average temperature rise below the threshold indicated by the science to avoid the climate change impacts incompatible with life on planet. The Fit for 55 package has been a step in the right direction, but it's not enough for the EU to comply with its commitment under the Paris Agreement. We need to make sure that when we say zero pollution action plan, we actually mean zero pollution and not just maintaining the status quo or reducing pollution to levels no longer deemed harmful to human health or ecosystems. There is no truly safe level of exposure to pollution. For instance, aiming at 55% reduction of health impacts from air pollution by 2030 is not the ambition level needed to tackle the leading cause of deaths from environmental pollutions. The EU should swiftly propose the full alignment of its air standards with WHO guidelines and the latest science. Moreover, the EU should urgently end the financial support to polluters and reinforce the application of the polluter pays principle. No amount of EU budget should be used to fund cleanup actions, and no amount of responsibility should be relayed onto taxpayers. Climate change mitigation and adaptation also require better protection of and restoration of biodiversity. Ecosystems such as peatlands, wetlands, floodplains, coastal areas, marine ecosystems, and others can act as natural sinks for carbon dioxide removals and provide solutions for climate adaptation. An ambitious nature restoration law delivering ecosystems restoration at scale, focusing as a priority on carbon-rich ecosystems, is crucial in delivering the commitments of the European Green Deal. The new restoration law must be targeted and directly actionable to result in large-scale restoration across Europe. It should be additional to the relevant EU directives, habitat, birds, water framework, etc., to reinforce and build upon existing obligations. Restoration of biodiversity is key not only for the climate crisis mitigation, but also for public health and preventing and making us fit against future pandemics. And finally, policies need to take into account social considerations, not only supporting those in need through the Climate Social Fund, but that will be not enough. We need to rethink the way we see economy, break up existing exploitative structures, and stop putting GDP ahead all objectives of EU policies. Even with the EU's target of at least 55% net emission reduction by 2030, teamed up with other pledges from other major emitters, we are still heading towards a global temperature rise of at least 2.5 degrees Celsius by the end of the 21st century. And such a dramatic temperature increase is estimated to cause 8% GDP loss in Europe already by 2050. That means we're already reached the point of no return. We need to steer away from the current destructive economy towards a socially and ecologically just one. And we need to make the economic system independent of growth to allow for reduction in the resources it consumes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tetiana. Well, a determining factor for having the European Green Deal and a major push for seeing environmental and climate policies moving to the core of policy making at the European level have been the young people taking to the streets, to social media, and directly addressing the decision makers. On the 24th of September, the climate strike was back in 1,400 locations around the globe, ahead of COP26 in Glasgow. And just yesterday, we saw around 50,000 people marching the streets here in Brussels. Now, you have delivered or conveyed a sense of urgency. You've been saying the 55% target is not enough. You are saying that this is really limiting the freedoms of future generations. You've been arguing for the 65% target. You also had a very clear message on the zero pollution ambition that, well, there's no truly safe level of any exposure to pollution. And many other of the points that you have referred to will for sure be picked up now during this panel debate. Now, we've heard it many times, what the ambitions behind the European Green Deal are in terms of carbon neutrality by 2050, zero pollution and thriving biodiversity. So with the European Green Deal 2 years in, key policy files have been put on the table now in 2021 and into 2022. We've been talking about the Fit for 55 package, which is meant to curb emissions by 55% by 2030. We've been talking about the Zero Pollution Action Plan, which recognizes that pollution has a very significant impact on health and the environment. And we're all expecting a very ambitious proposal for a new restoration law concerning healthy habitats and biodiversity by the end of the year. So let me invite the next speaker, Veronica Manfredi. She's here to represent the European Commission's DG Environment. She is the Director for Quality of Life, so responsible for air, water and industrial emissions in DG Environment. She has been working for the European Commission on various topics and files. Veronica, how is the EU charting the path to a healthy planet with the European Green Deal 2 years in, 2 years after it was launched? And specifically regarding the pollution crisis that we've been speaking about a lot this morning, what is your vision for progress on the Zero Pollution Action Plan in the second half of the European Green Deal, and what policies are you driving to make a change? Can you please check? Can you try again, Veronica? It's still muted. Yes, let's go to our next guest, and we will bring Veronica back in a minute. So before we hear about the EU's ambitions and the concrete plans for 2022, let's then look at another important level of governance, the cities and the regions, which we've already been talking about with Maria Nera this morning. So while the European level, the European policies, they set the framework and ensure equal standards across the EU 27, ambitious policies and laws have, of course, to be implemented and realized at member state level, at the regional and local level. So Françoise Bonnet is the Secretary General of ACR+, the Association of Cities and Regions for Sustainable Resource Management, an international network of cities and regions sharing the aim of promoting a sustainable resource management and of accelerating the transition towards a circular economy on their territories and beyond. Françoise, can you tell us what cities and regions in the EU are doing already now to accelerate the transition? Do you have inspiring examples for us on how cities and regions show leadership, for instance, in achieving a non-toxic circular economy or circular economy for climate mitigation? What is the unique role for cities and regions to become a catalyst for change?
Thank you very much. I hope you hear me. Yes, does it work? Wonderful. So thank you for inviting me and to be with you today. And yes, I think that cities and regions are really a key level towards a change and climate mitigation. Why? Because cities are where people live and consume. And of course, when you add the regional level, you can really add also a huge importance of production. And of course, municipalities are the closest to citizens who are also consumers. So we do believe that by promoting as much as possible a territorial hierarchy, so trying to develop activities and to find local solutions as much as possible, it can help in climate mitigation and decreasing our emissions, CO2 emissions. And cities and regions, they have the role to settle up strategies and, of course, to implement them. And I just think among our members to Brussels, Paris, Pays de la Loire, Scotland, Catalonia, or Navarra, who already voted circular economy strategies on their territories and trying, of course, to have concrete measures for their implementation. And among different measures, I think that one of the most important things is, of course, boosting circular production and consumption through public procurement, for example, or also by promoting eco-design through competitions like in Catalonia. But what is also an important sector is the food sector. It was already mentioned before. And so we have a lot of local policies pushing for good food for everybody. So starting from promoting urban farming and home production or at least neighborhood production of food, but also trying to promote composting, neighborhood composting and home composting, and of course having the right solution for organic fraction treatment, so the waste, the organic waste treatment. And just to give you a little example linking to air pollution, several years ago already, the little city of Besançon in France decided to promote home composting and neighborhood composting in order to decrease the quantity of organic waste sent to incineration, in order to decrease the capacity of the incineration, and so like that to have less incinerated waste and more return to the soil for the organic waste. And it worked. I think that also an important role for local and regional authorities is, of course, to promote the best solution, thinking about prevention, so having a sustainable consumption by prevention of our material resources use, reusing, recycling, using for that local and economic local legal and economic instrument like local taxes against, decreasing landfill and incineration, but also by local subsidies, promoting and boosting startups and local production, startups with new activities like leasing, so the economy of functionality in order to lasting more and more the product we put on the market. And of course, public authorities, they have a role of exemplarity. And in the building sector, it's a huge role to play in that. Not only for the energy part of buildings and new construction, but also trying more and more to boost cradle-to-cradle approach in new buildings. And in our members, you have already very good example in applying this approach. And last but not least, I would like to repeat the role of public authorities at local level of raising public awareness. And I would like to come back to the speech of the French minister. If I note it well, they gave us 4 priorities. The first one was boost the decarbonization of our economy and acceleration of our economic model. And I would like to stress the point on the fact that the two are linked. And with our More Circularity, Less Carbon campaign launched 2 years ago and a half, we try to give indicators and instruments to local authorities to show to the population that by having a sustainable consumption and production, so a sustainable behavior in our territories, we can really decrease our indirect emissions and also direct emissions, and like that contribute to climate mitigation. And linking that, I would like to give you some example in terms of non-toxic circular economy example. I was just discussing last week with Amsterdam and the area of Amsterdam, trying to have a comprehensive textile initiative in order to promote more and more sustainable textile on their territory and behind, because you know that with textile we can really decrease, and I mean sustainable production of textile, we can really decrease our CO2 emissions. And we have also to think about the microplastics that pollution occurred by the use of a certain textile. Of course, other non-toxic circular economy topic are plastics, and maybe another, maybe less known example is the tires. You know that an important microplastic pollution is due to tire erosion on our roads. And so now there is a coalition to put together different stakeholders in order to see how to tackle this issue. And of course, non-toxic circular economy also is concerned by our way to produce food and to consume food. So yes, I think that with decentralized authorities trying to put together different local stakeholders to boost local economy and trying to boost and to promote sustainable product on their territory in order to have a good consumption and consumption behavior, it really helps to have a decarbonized territory.
Thank you very much, Françoise, for this wealth of examples. Let's see if we can reconnect with Veronica Manfredi to hear from the European level how the EU is creating the framework in which then these great initiatives can thrive. So do we have a connection to Veronica now? Not yet. Okay, we'll try again later. So we'll then move and go back to the French government. We have with us Francesco Gaeta. He's a director in the French Ministry for the Ecological Transition. So we've heard it this morning from the minister. We know that the French Council presidency will have a lot on its plate. The minister has outlined the 4 priorities, making sure that the Council adopts ambitious positions around the Fit for 55 package is for sure one of them. Next to the carbon neutrality objective, we have been discussing the zero pollution ambition this morning and the need to chart the path to a healthy planet. So what does the French presidency intend to do to ensure strong positions in the Council on key files such as the Zero Pollution Action Plan? And also, what do you need from the other stakeholders, the other member states, the member state governments, business, civil society, to make your plans for 2022 a success?
Good morning, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure for me to be with you today and to speak about the French presidency for coming. It's our current job, day-by-day job, so it's interesting for me to exchange on that. In particular, because the minister this morning was very clear on our priorities, and she quoted that the fight against pollution is one of our main priorities for the French presidency. As a matter of fact, beyond the French presidency, France is very committed on this issue. First of all, on national level, with the adoption of very ambitious legislation that we are put in place now. And then at European level, as you know, we are member of an important coalition called Reach Up. This coalition is very committed to pushing forward the position in the Council and in Europe on these issues. If I had to synthesize what is our approach, is completely based on the notion of One Health. One Health is the I would say, the notion saying that our health is totally linked to the health of the environment and the preservation of biodiversity. That's why we consider that the only way to face these issues is to reduce the pollution at the source. And that's why we are quite supportive of European strategy on zero pollution, and would seize the opportunity, because I've seen that Veronica Manfredi is here, to thank again the Commission for the excellent work on this, because it is a very important basis for next jobs in the Council and the Parliament. What are our expectations as France and Presidency at the same time? We have some issues on that we really would like that the European Union can go forward. First of all is the definition of endocrine disruptors that can be used in all the frameworks, a sort of transversal definition in order to get rid of them towards zero pollution and through all the legislation that we have on the table. The second one is that we really want to withdraw from the market the most dangerous substances. Then we would like also, and we push for the end of the export of chemical substances which are already banned in EU, because this is completely contradictory. We are fighting against the massive use of pesticides and want to reduce it, and also to strengthen the resources of the European agency in order to make them able to produce report and analysis that can be at the basis of our decisions at legislative level. Then we would like to improve the financial parts of our legislation in Europe, in particular by establishing taxes on mineral and nitrogen fertilizers to fight against air pollution. And also we wait for a global strategy on soils, which are a major issue to prevent pollution, and also to make an end to plastic pollution in seas by 2025. So these are our expectations, and we will see what we will be able to have to discuss. At the moment, our project for the French presidency are to push forward the I would say the common position of the Council towards an ambition. We won't have enough material at the legislative level. We will see what Monica Manfredi will say, but Veronica Manfredi will say. But if there are on the table sufficiently early legislative proposals that we can deal with, we will do that. Anyway, we have foreseen to put this issue on the table of discussion, informal discussion at several high-level events under our presidency, in order to put together legislators, European Commissions, and civil societies, in particular ONGs, to make sure that we can progress on a common ambition positions at European level in order to facilitate not only in our presidency but also in following one the adoption of very strong legislation in this domain. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francesco Gaeta, for providing even more detail to the priorities outlined this morning by the Minister, and for adding a couple of more items to the table for our discussion this morning. Thank you also for explaining the commitment to the One Health approach, so the approach that the health of people, animals and the environment is extremely closely linked, and that needs action at local, national and global level. So I'm sure we'll come back to some of the points that you have highlighted. let me move to one of our other civil society speakers on the panel this morning. So we've been discussing already that the environmental crises that we're facing in the EU are of course not isolated from the rest of the world. Emissions obviously have global impacts, so has climate change. Pollution travels across borders. So we know that it is a few economies that have made the biggest contributions in terms of CO2 emissions historically and today. Some of the 10 biggest emitters have made new pledges. The EU is one of them. Canada, the UK and the US. Russia will allow for emissions to rise. China and India still have to make new pledges. Brazil, Indonesia and Japan do not improve on previous pledges. So I would like to now discuss with Asad Rehman. He's the director of The War on Want, a UK-based NGO seeking to put an end to poverty and to injustice globally. Asad has also been fighting for global justice for 25 years, but also as Friends of the Earth UK's international climate campaigner. So he brings in a lot of expertise on the global climate justice discussion. Well, we've heard it this morning. We have 3 more years to make the European Green Deal deliver on its promises with this current Commission, this current Parliament. The deal might not be as ambitious enough in some of the areas, including the 55% reduction target, and action is not yet fast enough. At the same time, it's also a very unique policy framework if we compare to other main emitters around the globe. So, Asad, what do you think? Is Europe doing enough to ensure a clean environment and health for everyone on this planet? What do you expect from Europe in the coming 3 years to ensure climate and environmental justice?
Thank you, and thank you again for the kind invitation to join you today. One of the other things that we do is we help coordinate a network around what a truly transformative global Green New Deal would look like. Listening to the previous speakers, I was just reminded of the words of the Secretary General of the UN, who said last year, COVID is exposing fallacies and falsehoods everywhere. The lie that free markets can deliver healthcare for all, the fiction that unpaid care work is not work, the delusion that we live in a post-racist world, and the myth that we're in the same boat. He could have, of course, gone on to say that the claim uttered by the richest countries in the world in the midst of the pandemic, that no one is safe until we're all safe, will ring us hollow because of the COVID vaccine apartheid as the unmet commitments to address the multiple crises facing many of the global south. And I think there is a question that must sit at the heart of all policy responses, which is, how do we guarantee and deliver the universal truth that every citizen of the world has a right to a dignified life? Now, without doubt, there is increasingly widespread recognition about the multitude and the magnitude of these multiple crises facing humanity, and they clearly have dwarfed anything we've previously faced in human history. But I find it fascinating that they sit alongside what I would term a continuing cognitive dissonance about both the scale and urgency and ambition of the action that's needed. So our starting point, of course, is we all recognize we live in a world which is driven by deep imbalances of power, many of them generated by historical injustices of recognition, distribution and exclusion. And these systems, of course, are entrenched over time. So over time, we're not equal, neither in our exposure to injustice nor in our capacity to address it. What is interesting, I find, is whilst the policy agendas of the EU and other international institutions in the global north now seem to be shaping around this, whether it's the Green New Deal or Build Back Better or Just Transition, and that they've been promoted as addressing both the climate crisis and the crisis of economic inequality, the real question remains, are these proposals fair? Are they just? And what do they mean for the majority of the world's citizens? And for those of us working on a framework of a global Green New Deal, which situates itself on the realities of the front lines of injustice rather than the capitals of power and what is pragmatically possible, I think we have to look at this through 4 critical tests, and uphold all proposals, including the European Union's Green New Deal. Does it meet the goal of limiting temperatures to below 1.5 with absolutely everybody doing their fair share of effort? Does it tackle economic inequality by ensuring everyone has a living wage, workers' rights, social protection, access to free and universal public services? And does it put well-being and the right of everyone to thrive in balance with planetary limits ahead of unsustainable growth and extraction of resources? And have policies in place such as around public goods, such as energy and food, to make them a fundamental right for all, equitably shared, and not simply for corporate profit. And also importantly, does it recognize that we need to undo this embedded systems of injustice, whether that's racism, patriarchy, or economic, that have just become embedded into our global economic and political systems? So we go beyond a circular economy to a circular world where financial flows scale commensurate with need, without conditionalities, where technology is needed for the transition and not subject to either TRIPS or unfair trade rules, and also recognizes, of course, that the capacity of the richest countries has been built on the extraction of resources and exploitation of people in the global south. And we don't have time here, but we could go on and speak for a long time about an arc that connects everything from slavery, colonialism, today's economic wealth. And here, of course, with this learning audience, I don't need to spend time setting out the climate case. But what is interesting is, whilst the goal of limiting temperatures to 1.5 degrees, as set out in the Paris Agreement, is repeated ad nauseum, it sits at the centre of the European Green New Deal. We know, of course, as the latest UN report says, we're still heading for a warming of 2.7% with global emissions increasing. I actually find that the conversation around the actual carbon budget for 1.5 seems to be either willfully ignored or relies on real fantasy accounting and unproven technologies and risky technologies around the net zero 2050 goal. Look, it's important to state, when we think about the carbon budget, and historical emissions obviously matter, as it's the cumulative emissions that led us to a warming of 1.2. We've collectively emitted 2.5 billion tons since 2,500 billion tons since 1850. It leaves us less than 500 gigatons of CO2 for the remaining carbon budget of 1.5. It's estimated by the end of 2021 we'll have burnt through 89% of that budget for a 2 in 3 chance of meeting the 1.5 degree guardrail. And let's just dwell on that for a second. That means that there's a 1 in 3 chance that we'll breach the 1.5 degree guardrail. And recognizing no temperature is safe and it's deadly for many, we all know that breaching that begins a spiral into runaway climate change that will dwarf the killer floods, fires, and famines that we can see wreaking havoc and destroying people's lives and livelihoods. And I find it really interesting that no policymaker in the global north would countenance any public policy for their citizens that included that level of risk. Neither would any of us who are on this call today would board a bus or a train if they were told that it had a 1 in 3 chance of crashing. But that is what public policy in the global north is being prefaced on. Secondly, whilst we all know that the richest countries in the world, those most responsible, have the most capacity to act and the legal obligation, what's fascinating is these plans for what I would call capturing the remaining carbon budget. It's a modern form of carbon colonialism. You're pushing for more loopholes through offsets and carbon markets. And we seem to have moved from what was an era of climate denialism to an era of mitigation denialism, with targets being pushed towards 2050, when we know that the requirements of both science and justice is for fair share, is for rich countries like the European Union and others to do real zero targets by 2030. And just to give you an illustration, as one-on-one, we've worked with Stockholm Environment Institute and others to do a calculation of what the UK's fair share would be. And a calculation of that would be, it would be minus 200% by 2030. So not only would it need to be at real zero and decarbonize, but it would need to provide comparable effort to support less well-off countries and finance, and so that they can grow cleanly. And the scale of finance, UNCTAD has said we need at least 1.4 trillion a year for the next decade. That's been similar figures have been put forward by climate scientists, and yet the scale of the external support, for example, purely on climate, is an unmet promise of 100 billion that largely relies on loans and recycling of other aid commitments. So what, for me, the most important things is not what the targets that are announced, is what are the plans and policies behind them? And it feels like tough talk on climate is now the go-to place, but whilst continuing, of course, the same policies, fossil fuel subsidies, locking in new fossil fuel infrastructure, as the EU is doing, even as the IEA categorically states no new gas, oil or coal expansion is possible under the 1.5 degree guardrail. Financial institutions, both public, EU and private, continue to provide financial oxygen to the industry, and policymakers, particularly in the global north, continue with what we call say is a sort of do what I say, not what I do, to the rest of the world. And the realities of the COVID pandemic, which have exposed these structural inequalities and injustices, both within our own societies in the global north, and we all know that low-paid and poorer communities paid the heavy price, but it also starkly exposed those between societies in the north and south. And what's interesting is, whilst many countries in the richest parts of the world threw away the economic rule book and they imposed on others, they directly intervened in their economies, those very same tools and financial means are, of course, denied to many countries in the global south. And even today, close to 80% of the IMF loans given to the poorest countries to deal with the pandemic require future austerity cuts, at the very same time as we know that it's been the decades of structural adjustment programs, unsustainable debt payments, that have denied the policy space and tools to invest in the very systems, health, social protection, public services, which have been critical, not just meeting the pandemic, but are the key adaptive tools to address climate inequality. And if I have a couple of minutes, I just want to say something also about the importance of tackling inequality. Look, we all know that it's a huge challenge within rich countries, but it's also between the richest and the majority of the world. And we, of course, face this dichotomy. We have a world of great abundance, yet half the world still struggles to live on the equivalent of $5.50 a day. We have half the world without access to electricity or clean cooking, close to 2 billion people facing issues of hunger. And of course, that's comparable with lacking housing, health, education. Global inequality isn't getting better, it's actually getting worse. And if the responses of rich countries is devised around competitiveness and a new expansion of resource use, from green metals and minerals to new metal mining, that some estimate will see a doubling of current resource extraction, when we know that the sustainable use of our planet's materials requires a massive reduction. The answer simply won't be found in electric batteries or even in a circular economy, but actually in a circular world. And that requires, I think, a much more a politics that isn't shaped by a lack of imagination and ambition, or the same repeating of the same sort of failed and deadly approaches, which have created this uneven and broken world that we inherit. I think it requires a vision of international solidarity, which I see largely missing in the EU's plans.
Thank you very much, Asad, for these very clear words and outlining your vision of a transformative global Green New Deal. Well, you mentioned it very briefly towards the end of your intervention, that also, of course, if we look within our region, if you look within Europe, health impacts, environmental impacts are not equally distributed between everybody equally. So do you think that if we look at the current Green Deal policies, do you think we're doing enough to make sure that the costs of the transition will not burden those who are already struggling in our societies? If you have a brief insight on that.
No, we are not, and it shows a lack of joined up policies. Here in the UK at this very moment, for example, we have a situation where we know we have a pandemic which has pushed millions more people into poverty. We have about 2.7 million people relying on food banks. We have 4 out of 10 people who are in work poverty. They require that work is not paying enough for them to be able to make ends meet. We now see an increase in energy prices. We see a number of different issues all at play. And the response to these is not joined up. You would think that the immediate response would be to think about both, how are we tackling energy poverty by rolling out a massive wave of retrofitting of homes, of energy efficiency? How do we also at the same time look to reduce inequality by ensuring that it's not the poorest communities who are hit hardest in their pockets. Because both from a moral point of view, but also from a political point of view, without the social license of communities buying into the transition, we know that we will not have the political legitimacy to deliver the kind of rapid transition that is needed. And that's been played out, of course, in every single country across Europe. We've seen the realities of a decade of austerity. It's pushed some of the poorest parts of our society deeper and deeper into inequality and poverty. And unless we are centering and ensuring that the green transition is not only transitioning in terms of on climate, but addressing the critical issue of inequality and injustice within our societies, we're not going to be able to deliver the transition that is needed.
Thanks a lot, Asad. So unfortunately, I understand that Veronica Manfredi has a technical problem and she won't be able to join us this morning. So at this stage in the discussion, I would have asked her what the European Commission's learnings are from the COVID crisis and this kind of display of inequalities and the inequalities that have deepened in our societies due to the pandemic, and what the Commission's takeaway is to put well-being and health higher up on the political agenda. We know that DG Environment and the other DGs are currently working on mainstreaming equality issues into the diverse policy areas. So that would have been very interesting here to explore with DG Environment, and we'll do that on another occasion. So, but I also know that we can discuss that question with Francesco Gaeta. Well, the minister has already mentioned it this morning. She said it right at the beginning of her intervention that climate action and our social objectives can only be thought together. Now, Francesco, France has had its very own experience with the Yellow Vests, which has shown the need for a just transition and to ensure buy-in from the whole of society. Now, the EU has adopted the Just Transition Fund. It's targeted at economic diversification and reconversion, and research and innovation, and reskilling workers in the most affected areas. Then there's also the Social Climate Fund, which is meant to finance temporary direct income for those households and to support measures and investments to reduce emissions in road transport and the building sectors, and to make that possible for the low-income households. So, Francesco, do you think that these measures at the European level are enough to make the transition just? Or is there anything else that we need to do?
Thank you very much for this question. It's true that we have a huge experience on what it means when the transition is not necessarily understood as just. And that's why for us is a major challenge in the implementation of Fit for 55. There will be no change if the transformation is not supported by all society. In my opinion, there are two dimensions in that. First of all, that's clear, and you said it, we should avoid that part of our population is left behind, what we call the losers of transition. The second point, and this is also very important, is that we should make sure that all the layers of the society contribute with commitment to the change. And if we consider that these two dimensions are right, then we cannot limit the discussion only on two specific funds that are limited in action. I think in particular to the just transition. As you know, the just transition concern only limited territories, or the new proposed social climate fund, which cover also limited public. We should consider that investment in transition is a transversal global issue for European Union and for member states, which means concretely that the European budget on one side, the recovery funds on the other side, the national investment funds are used to underpin the transition towards a new society decarbonized, suitable, and very fast transformed. This is for public funds, but then you have the private funds, which are also a key issue to orient the investments. And we see this issue with the taxonomy discussions and taxonomy regulation, how it is important that towards the private investments, we arrive to reconcile the issue of the profits with the transformation of our society. Behind the funds, there are the approaches at national European level, because the society that we wish for tomorrow has to be prepared today, which means that the investments are to be done today in the right directions, and also training has to be, I would say, be more suitable for the society that we are preparing for tomorrow. The last point is that if we don't want that anybody is behind, as we said at the beginning, and we want that everybody is committed in pushing for the new world, it must be clear that investing in transition is a good affair for everybody. And we have, I think, a good example today, which is the proposed regulation on battery. Because if you look at that, you have on one side the idea, clear idea to how to reduce our ecological footprints. And on the other side, we do that creating conditions of our technological sovereignty, which means that at the same time, we are creating and protecting our jobs, creating the conditions of the welfare of tomorrow, while pushing for more ecological friendly world. So my opinion is that, as you understand, funds are not enough. All the system has to be oriented towards the transition.
Thank you very much, Francesco. Well, let's go back to Françoise and the level of the cities and regions. So we've been talking about now the fact that some groups in our cities and regions are disproportionately affected by pollution and other environmental burdens. The European Environmental Agency has shown how low-income groups are more exposed to pollution while having less access to green spaces. We've also talked about this morning with Maria Nera. Now, the EB has recently exposed many situations of environmental discrimination, for instance, against Roma communities across cities and municipalities in the region. Another example is our mobility concepts that are not sufficiently accessible, for instance, to people with reduced mobility, or that are not sufficiently attractive for women. So how can cities and regions drive a just transition that benefits everybody equally? And what are cities doing to make sure that nobody is left behind?
Thank you to give me the floor again on this very important topic. And I would like also to come back to this social aspect and inequality, just to give you a little bit my thought also. When we started thinking more and more and discussing more and more about circular economy and transition of our system, we saw a lot of big companies going through this new concept, and we were a little bit afraid representing public authorities and of course the general interest. So not only the economy, but we have three pillars. So of course also environment, but also the social pillar. And where you see that at the beginning, circular economy could be understood as a cost efficiency. It's not enough at all. Of course, we have the environmental aspects and the social aspects, and I think that the Yellow Vest movement showed clearly that all the policies should be inclusive with all these aspects. And I can also agree on the fact that funds are not enough. We have to think about this aspect everywhere. And so at local level, of course, we can do something. And especially with this transition towards a more sustainable economy, so circular economy should be sustainable. We can promote local economy and low income low qualified jobs that can help those part of the population who are not always included. And of course, there is a big problem on that. At that local level, again, with public procurement, we can also do the difference by putting certain criteria in order to have equality, for example, gender equality regarding salaries, etc. When you subcontract for doing a certain works, or of course with public transport and having differentiated tariff towards those communities. So I really think that at local level we can make good examples in order to upscale this problem, this issue that should have to be tackled at a very global level. So yes, we have instruments also at local level. It won't do everything, but it can help. And especially with those local taxes, you can differentiate taxes towards household incomes, transport policies, building policies. Also, you can have social housing with very good performances that can help in reducing your electricity bills and heating bills. So we need to have ambitions in this kind of policies towards inequalities. So we have already good examples, and I was thinking about, for example, Pamplona, who has a very precise guidelines on public procurement and how to tackle those issues in public procurements. And it's really an important driver for local authorities.
Thank you very much, Françoise. I would also like to hear from Tetiana what her thoughts are on the discussion on, well, on the one hand, delivering on our environmental and climate objectives, and at the same time ensuring it's a just transition. So, Tetiana, we've just heard from Francesco Gaeta, who said, well, just transition is not just about funds, it's also about deeper systemic change that needs to ensure justice. Looking at the social justice aspect and from a perspective of young people who in our region and across the EU are kind of overrepresented in low-income groups who suffer most from unemployment and lack of opportunities. So what is your take on the discussion around a just transition, and what more is needed apart from the instruments that have already been presented?
Well, absolutely. When it comes to the just transition, we talk about it all the time in the youth movement, that at the moment, the youth movement is unfortunately very much white, middle class, privileged, because the young people who are coming from those marginalized groups and who have lower opportunities, they do not have the capacity or the opportunity for the privilege of volunteering to spend their free time doing the work that we're doing in the youth movement at the moment. We are trying to build up the narrative of needing a large shift and not just incremental steps towards making the just transition. And it has already been said when it comes to the priorities for the French presidency, the legislations that there will be focus on the zero pollution ambition. I would also like to ask once again to take the freedoms of the future generations seriously and urgently raised ambitions. And for example, an upcoming opportunity for the French presidency lies in the fact that France will hold the EU presidency in the first half of 2022, when the co-design process towards the new EU nature restoration law will start. And it's crucial to ensure French support for an ambitious restoration law to make sure France will put their political weight behind an ambitious position. And when it comes to what is further needed for the just transition and for young people, for instance, to engage more into the processes that we have been discussing, I will mention one thing that keeps coming up in every meeting, every discussion with other youth movements, groups, and networks. And this one thing, it's something that can be done already next week. The youth movement has gained momentum through climate strikes, but this is not enough. Now we need resource to work towards concrete policy change. There is already available funding being channeled towards environmental action. And for example, I'm now relying on the European Foundation Center report on environmental funding by European foundations. In 2018, 127 European foundations already made 5,000 environmental grants worth a combined 700 million. And no, this is not sufficient for the environmental and climate action, but this is the funding which is already available. But only a fraction is being channeled towards youth-led projects. And we see time and time again adult organizations being funded to work with young people instead of funding youth-led organizations directly. We are grateful to those who are already supporting young people directly, but that's just a fraction of what is possible. And time again, governments, private donors, foundations, funded adult NGOs reach out to us because they want to work with us, but they expect us to meaningfully engage into environmental matters, understand the legislation, follow the negotiation processes, participate in the decision-making processes, organize and attend meetings, write policy papers, create social media content, disseminate knowledge in ways that our peers would listen, mobilize hundreds of young people in our free time for a fraction of funding that would not cover one person's living expense. And while doing that, you dare be less inspiring than Greta. This is something that I've actually heard. Meanwhile, young people are also expected to get their education, build careers, pay their rents, maintain healthy relationships, work-life balance, support their families, and perhaps build fair families of their own while staying sane in the face of the climate crisis. And through channeling the funding, and I'm talking about the funding that is already available to the youth-led organizations, you give us a chance for intergenerational equity. You're giving a chance to those young people who cannot afford the privilege to volunteer, those young people whose lives are directly already being the most affected by the climate crisis, a chance to have their voices heard. We don't need yet another webinar or toolkit done by adults for young people, and absolutely no further awareness raising on how young people can decrease their own carbon footprint. No. What we need is direct long-term investment. And please do not lose the chance to invest into younger generation directly. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tetiana. Now we have quite some questions from the audience, and we'll go into these in a minute. So just to remind you to share your thoughts on social media, #EB21. And there's also another question on HowSpace that we have asked you. It's about, well, if we all know what needs to be done, what is it actually that hinders us and all the stakeholders from speeding up the transition? So share your opinion with us, and we'll get back to the results after the panel debate. So I'm looking at the questions here from the audience. So there's two more questions which touch upon the international responsibility of the EU. So I'll start with these first. Asad, I'd like to get back to you. There's a question from Deborah. She is saying, how do we actually build the international solidarity that we need? How do we build it quickly in an increasingly fractured world where our only chance in meeting what we want to achieve and meeting our climate and biodiversity targets is actually, I mean, we can only do that through actually working together. So what is your advice on building international solidarity?
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like the very moment that we need more global solidarity, more global cooperation, the world is dominated by a politics which is retreating behind walls and fences, rise of nationalism, right-wing populism, etc. And it feels like, how do we shift the dial, right? But that's, I think, this true of how do we shift the dial in multilateral institutions. We know that, you know, what's missing is is political will, and political will is, of course, tied to our political power as individual citizens and collectively as active citizens. And there is a wider question, of course, about the democratic deficit that exists. That means that, you know, we still have political systems which overwhelmingly are influenced and shaped by decision makers and policy makers who listen more to big business, corporations, and etc. in their interests than the people, and that's created a sense of disconnecting to the political system, of people feel either apathetic or feeling disillusioned with it and feeling it can't be done. But we can move the dial very, very rapidly. And I totally agree with everything that Tetiana said. I mean, if you just think about how fast the dial has been moved, just even in the last few years, through everything from the youth climate strikers to the work that's been done over decades by climate justice groups in the global south about centering the climate reality. We know this from the 1970s onwards, but in the last few years, we've seen a massive shift. And so that transition can happen very, very rapidly, and it can happen very, very quickly, as long as we are both working, I think, at the local and global level. Now, at the global level, there's a big question, you know, are our multilateral institutions fit for purpose? Do we need to be looking beyond, you know, institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO to a new kind of multilateral structure that would deliver a global just transition, that would ensure that we don't have the discussions taking place in the climate negotiations being undermined by discussions taking place at the WTO, undemocratic spaces like the IMF and World Bank designing policies that don't meet the climate targets or don't meet imperatives of tackling inequality, which are divorced from the realities of the discussions around, you know, protection of our ecosystems and nature. So it does require a more joined up thinking. And of course, many of us thought, well, that's what the SDG 2030 would provide. Of course, what's lacking there is the means of implementation, and that, I think, is the really thorny issue, is in terms of this question about the finance and technologies that are needed. How do we address that? Well, you know, I mean, ultimately, it's our responsibility, right? We are the ones. Nobody's going to come and change the world. Nobody's going to come and save us apart from ourselves. And so the first and foremost is we have to build our collective power. Wherever we are, in whatever organization or institution, they have to build that power. And that means centering the global as well as the local and national, and making sure that our policies speak to the requirements at a global level and not simply shaped by what we think is politically pragmatic within our domestic context.
Thank you, Asad. So there's another question which is linked to our global responsibility, and I'd like to ask it to Francesco Gaeta. So there's a question from Andra Phillips, who's asking, how can the EU's next presidencies extend stronger pressure on other developed countries that are dragging their feet and that allow for poor examples, such as Australia, that's not reducing its reliance on coal, and the coal sales damaging the Great Barrier Reef. I mean, obviously there's other examples. So what can the EU and especially the presidencies do to well, put more pressure on our peers?
Thank you very much. This question is quite related to the previous one, and it's true that we cannot consider that once the European Union has adopted all the legislation on Fit for 55, restoration, that was mentioned by our young colleague, it's okay, because at European level would be enough to fight against climate change and pollution. This is not true at all, and we know it. We are very small compared to the dimension of the problems, and this implies that we have to use our legislation, our strong position at European level, to be ready and to be able to change in the world the I would say the attitude and the politics that are made. There are several possibilities to do that. One of them is one of our priorities, is to use the commercial policy to influence the politics in our counterparts, economical counterparts. This is a very strong instrument, and we are really supportive of commercial agreements, international commercial agreements that include specific clauses with regards to the respect of the Paris Agreement for climate, but also what we call the mirror clauses, which are the respect of a certain number of environmental legislation, environmental standards that we apply in Europe and we need to be applied elsewhere if we have to exchange products. This is a very strong instrument, and we push very, very, very strong for that, enlarging what we call the mirror clauses. This is only the way we are working today with the European Commission and the other member states on the issues of deforestation. Is a good example, in my opinion. The only way, one of the major, I would say, instrument that we have, the only way to reduce deforestation is an enormous issue for climate and biodiversity, is to avoid that European Union can import products, commodities, which are at the beginning one of the reasons of deforestation. And we are working strongly with the Commission to have a legislation allowing the public policies to influence the attitude of the enterprises. So I agree totally with the idea that we have instruments to do that, and we are able to make a change if we are conscious that we are strong in the world as European Union, and we can really influence the others when we, in particular, work on the agreements with the other states. And we will see how it will work, because we will have at the international level 2 major events close to today. First of all, we will have the COP26 on climate change, and we will see at what level we will be able to influence the ambition of commitments of other states. We did the job at the European level, but now it's clear that it's not enough to reduce emissions in Europe when others don't do that. We mentioned Australia with the coal, but we can consider other states, as you know, that are very polluting. And what is expected from us is to be, I would say, able to show our commitments not only in reducing emission, but also to support other states with financial instruments. And then in COP15 for biodiversity, we will have to build a new framework for protecting biodiversity, where also it won't be enough to show our availability to engage. We also need to show how we will support other states to make the same commitments that we have done. So European Union is an answer to the change that we need at the international level, when European Union is ambitious in its own legislation, clear in the relations with the other states, and ready to support the efforts of other states. I think these are the 3 major key points that can make European Union really efficient at the international level.
Thank you, Francesco. Well, after having talked about the EU's, the need for EU leadership at the international level, there is another question which brings us back to what the regional level and also the cities need. So there's a comment or a question from Frédéric, who's saying that, well, it's true that the promotion of sustainable solutions at the local level is a key part of success. but what can be done, what must be done, so that the ambitions, so that the national strategies can build on kind of these ambitions effectively. And what is it that the national and regional levels need from the EU to become that key part of the solution? And I would like to link that question to a more specific topic that you, Françoise, have already mentioned. You have been talking about the building sector, which of course is one of the key sectors that we need to tackle in terms of, coming to carbon neutrality, but also in achieving a circular economy. So maybe you can also elaborate a little bit more when we look at the building sector, where we know that we can save up to 2/3 of the current energy demands by 2050. We have several policies now in place that are meant to contribute to this. The Social Climate Fund, eco-design, of course, and also the restoration wave. So what is it that the cities and regions need to contribute to the energy efficiency principle in the building sector?
Thank you. A lot of questions, huge topic also. I'm not sure I will be able to answer to everything in details, but I think that first of all, regions must to be listened. And you know that within the EU, we have different performances among the regions. And when we report to the Commission, it's always at national level. So I think that it's really important to look at also the regional level in order to be able to give the right instrument and the right finance and funds to the country, because you know better than me that when you look at, for example, Italy or Spain or other countries, when you speak about the north or the south, you do not have the same performances and maybe not the same needs neither. So I think that at EU level, it's really important to have it in mind and to have a more detailed or more in-depth, more local eyes to what have to be done. Regarding the building sectors, I think that of course we have already mainly at regional level more than maybe at city level. It depends, of course, on the member states and how your administrative competencies are.
Okay, it seems we have lost Françoise for a minute, so maybe we can come back to her once the connection is re-established. So I have another question for Francesco Gaeta about the upcoming REACH and the pesticides regulation. So the question here is, well, first, the comment is that these two policy documents or instruments are, of course, crucial for the EU to ensure its legislation is up to date with the latest science and ensure sufficient levels of protection for people and the environment. Now, you've already spoken about the topic of pesticides, highly hazardous pesticides. You also mentioned the problem of these pesticides being exported and still being used in other parts of the world while they're still they're already banned within the EU. Now, this question is about the changes also within the EU to ensure sufficient levels of protection. So when we look at the important changes needed in REACH to restrict toxic chemicals in consumer products, which is a commitment in the chemical strategy, how will the French presidency ensure that through this regulatory review, we lead the EU towards very high levels of ambition and that we introduce the new vision for toxic-free products, which also links back to Tetiana's initial statement that, well, zero pollution is really about zero pollution, because it's not about just putting up higher limits. So what do we do to get to toxic-free consumer products, Francesco?
Yes, thank you very much for these questions, which is important because I had the opportunity at my previous intervention to insist on the importance of the implementation of this strategy. The key issue is I would say, the implementation, transversal implementation of the principle of precaution, which is fundamental, which means that we don't put on the market any product that is not clearly without risk. That's the meaning. And to be able to do that, I mean, to be able to be confident on the quality of the product and the fact that these products are without risk, we need essentially to have on the table clear elements from the companies. You know that when you judge of the the quality of a product, the impact of a product, you need to dispose of the elements made by tests in laboratory, tests in real terms, and for that it is essential that we improve the quality of the dossier which are presented by companies. This is the first thing. Otherwise, we are not able to check. And the second one, I told it, we need that the agencies are more capable to foreseeing ongoing the test and to reevaluate the elements which are done by the companies. This system has to be improved in order to be sure that we are going to approve products, substances which are not harmful for our health. And this is very essential. That's why we are so, we have so many expectations towards the REACH regulation review.
Thank you, Francesco. So I think we have Françoise back. So Françoise, you get another opportunity to answer to the previous questions about, especially about the building sector and what needs to be done to support cities and regions in getting to higher levels of energy efficiency. And more generally, is there kind of another final message that you have for us? What you need from the perspective of the cities and regions to play your part in the transition?
Thank you. I hope I won't be lost again. I think that we have already very good practices at regional and local level and municipal level to have this sustainable building policy implemented regarding energy efficiency, and also behind. I mean, also, as I mentioned before, the cradle-to-cradle policy and strategy. So I think that just duplicating a little bit what has been done already in other regions, I think just about, for example, Brussels, but you have also other examples, and also in the north of Europe, where really there is a strong regional policy trying to give incentives to citizens who want to repair and restore their houses in certain way, showing the example with new buildings, public buildings, passive buildings, etc. We have huge of examples, and I think that now it's just a question of scaling up the best practices. And for that, I think that at EU level, we should collaborate more between the different decision levels, and also capitalize on what has been done already, not invent the wheel already, because we know that some practice really give strong results. So just helping regions where it's more difficult, financially speaking, or with capacity building, to duplicate this kind of practices should help a lot.
Thanks a lot, Françoise. So I will have one final question for each of the other panelists, or also give you the opportunity to kind of sum up the discussion from your point of view, if you have any other final message that you want to share with us. So I'll quickly go back to Francesco, because it's also related to a question we got, and then I'll give the floor again to Asad and Tetiana also for a concluding remark or your takeaways from this morning's discussion. So, Francesco, feel free to comment on any of the other topics that the colleagues have touched upon. But I would still like to ask you about the question of the direction of where the EU's spending should be going. So the question of finance for sustainability. We've heard this morning that we still have issues around not just fossil fuel subsidies, but also other kinds of investments and money going into creating new lock-ins. We have heard that funding needs to go into the just transition. Of course, it needs to go into buildings, it needs to go into youth engagement, we heard. So maybe in your final comment, if you also would like to comment on your vision and your government's vision on the future direction of spending. Of course, we still have the ongoing debate on the taxonomy for sustainable finance. We will also have to look into how the national plans under the recovery and resilience facility are actually being implemented. We already have signs that while most of the governments are spending a part of the funds on climate action, they're also spending it on investments that actually undermine our climate and other environmental objectives. So of course the follow-up of these plans, of their implementation, will also be important in 2022. So maybe you also want to comment on that in your final intervention, Francesco.
Yes, thank you. I have only one comment on that. I think that everybody should consider that all the finance investments should be under the principle of do not harm. That's the rule for me. And once we are okay on this principle, then it will be easier. In particular, with regards to the discussion we have had together today on the transition that has to be just and quick. As regards the French recovery plan, the French recovery plan has a target of 30% for climate and the principle do no harm for the 70% lasting. We have the same at the European level. For sure, it's not the case at the international level. Very difficult, very tough. I am also the negotiator in G7 and G20 for environmental track. I can I can say that it's very, very tough, but we are progressing. In particular, if you look at the G7 final communique for environment, we have for the first time a decision on stopping all the investments on unbeaten coal this year. From 7 strong countries in the world, more economically developed country. Okay, we don't have the same commitment for the G20, but this is a movement that we have to support all together. There are several changes in the world that make us confident. We see the change in the United States and in other parts of the world. We have to really invest in this kind of change to make sure that transition can be really done in the forthcoming years, and before that it's too late. But for sure, if we want to make it simply and easy, apply the principle of do not harm, and it will be for sure easier to get at the targets that we have for the financial investments.
Thank you very much, Francesco, for this answer, and also for all the level of detail on the 4 priorities of the French presidency of the Council in 2022. Well, I'll just give the floor for like a super short 1-minute final statement to our other 2 speakers, to Asad and to Tetiana, who have brought to the table very important ideas around the need for a transformative global Green New Deal, and also with Tetiana, well, bringing the sense of urgency that the young generation is feeling to the table. So a very short final statement from Asad and from Tetiana. Not more than 1 minute, please.
I'll be a minute. So I think we need to go beyond do no harm to undo harm, and that means for all EU policies, both inside and outside, ensuring fair share of 1.5, tackling inequality and sustainability. I think is a recognition that in this game we're in this moment, winning slowly is the same as losing. So it's not simply about coal, but oil and gas as well. Recognizing the realities of a decade of austerity, a low-wage economy, that was a political choice inside the EU and beyond. And so the big question for all policymakers is, will the same failed economic paradigm that has led us to where we are this moment be able to deliver the sustainable and just transition that we want? And just one final thing, I would just say, the EU's stated policy is still competitiveness, trade at any cost. The fact that trade deals have been signed by the European Union without scrutiny, that incorporate corporate courts, that block the ability for citizens around the world to protect themselves, environmental standards and health standards, shows how big institutions and countries don't have joined up plans between their climate and economic policies.
Thank you, Asad. Tetiana, we started with you because we wanted to start the discussion really with the vision and the demands from the youth environmental movement. So I'll give you the floor again to basically close the panel with your final statement.
Thank you. Well, seeing the smart accounting behind the 55% emission reduction goal and the phrasing behind the zero pollution ambition and action plan, I realize, as well as many young people, we realize that there is a need that we stay alert and that we remain the watchdogs, because we feel like we're in a battle, and we're trying to not lose hope, but then every time we see the smart accounting and phrasing, that gives us another punch, but we rise up and we walk further. We do it in our free time instead of working on new ideas or developing new engineering projects, let's say. We watch our governments avoiding doing the type of things that I've mentioned just in the beginning of my statement. And we will continue doing that despite this taking us aback as a society. Thank you.
Thank you, Tetiana. So we've come to the end of our time for this panel discussion. So I would just like to thank you, the four of you, Francesco Gaeta, Françoise Bonnet, Asad Rehman, and of you, Tetiana Stadnyk, for being with us this morning. I think it was a very rich discussion. A lot of different things have been discussed. So thank you very much for bringing all your different ideas and demands to the table. After a very short break, we will now go to the conclusion of the first part of this conference with our Secretary General, Jeremy Waits, and my colleague, Patrick Tenbrink, will explain to you how we'll proceed with the conference after the lunch break this afternoon. So thank you very much again for joining us, and see you for the second half of the conference.